Chloe Martins was 3 hours deep into case files when her office door opened at 9 p.m. past when any legitimate client would visit. The man in the Tom Ford suit didn't ask if she was available. He simply sat down, placed a briefcase containing more cash than she'd seen in her life on her desk, and said 5 words that would destroy everything she'd built. "I need help. Are you brave?" 6 years of building her reputation from nothing. 6 years of proving a girl from West Philadelphia could make it. And this stranger was about to burn it all down. Chloe Martins had learned 3 things growing up poor in West Philadelphia. Trust your instincts, read the fine print, and never take money you haven't earned. Which was why, 2 weeks after accepting Albert Jackman's case, she was violating her own rules and hating herself for it. The retainer had been obscene. $50,000 up front for what Albert described as corporate defense, nothing complicated. Her associates, Jamie and Rochelle, had practically done cartwheels when she deposited the check. Her modest Center City office could finally upgrade from the temperamental coffee maker that only worked when you hit it at the right angle. But the case file Albert had provided was too clean, too carefully curated, like someone had gone through and removed everything that mattered, leaving only what they wanted her to see. Chloe had built her practice on instinct and thorough investigation. She'd clawed her way through Temple University law on scholarships and spite, graduated top of her class, and turned down corporate offers to open her own firm because she was tired of watching powerful people buy their way out of consequences. She believed in justice, real justice, the kind that didn't care about your bank account, which was why she was currently breaking into sealed court records at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Well, breaking in was strong. She had legitimate credentials to access the database. She was just accessing files that were technically sealed pending federal review, files that mentioned Albert Jackman's name in connection with things that made her stomach drop. The first red flag was a witness protection reference, sealed testimony from someone identified only as Witness J7, describing Albert's presence at a business meeting in Atlantic City, where someone had ended up permanently unavailable for further comment. The meeting had involved Louise White. Chloe's hands went cold. Everyone in Philadelphia knew that name. Louise White was the 70-year-old man who allegedly controlled everything from the Delaware River to the Poconos. Allegedly, because no prosecutor had ever made charges stick. Louise White was a ghost who lived in a mainline mansion and had never spent a day in custody despite 30 years of law enforcement's best efforts. She kept digging, found financial records showing shell companies, offshore accounts, and transactions that looked suspiciously like money moving through legitimate businesses to hide its criminal origins. Found incident reports describing Albert at locations where federal investigations had mysteriously stalled. Found a confidential FBI memo identifying him as a high-value associate within White's organization. "Oh God," Chloe whispered to her empty office. "Oh God, what did I do?" She'd taken money from someone connected to organized crime. She'd signed her name to documents defending someone who was part of the exact system she'd spent her career trying to dismantle. Her firm's reputation, everything she'd built, was about to become collateral damage in someone else's criminal enterprise. Her phone buzzed. A text from Albert. "How's the research going?" Chloe stared at the message. The casual tone felt obscene given what she'd just discovered. She imagined him somewhere expensive, drinking something she couldn't pronounce, completely unconcerned that he'd just destroyed her life by walking through her door. She typed back, "We need to talk. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. my office." His response came immediately. "I'll be there." Chloe didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment in Rittenhouse Square, the nice apartment she'd finally been able to afford after years of struggle, and watched the city lights blur through tears she refused to let fall. She'd worked too hard to lose everything because she'd been seduced by a big retainer and a client with a face that belonged in movies. By 8:45 a.m., she was in her office wearing her best suit, like armor. Jamie had brought coffee and bagels, cheerfully oblivious to the catastrophe brewing. Rochelle was on a call with a client, her laughter carrying through the thin walls. At exactly 9 a.m., Albert Jackman stepped off the elevator. He looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more dangerous. The same expensive suit, the same commanding presence, but now Chloe saw what she'd missed before, the way his eyes constantly scanned exits, the controlled precision of his movements, the underlying tension of someone always prepared for threats. "Chloe," he said warmly, like they were friends, like he hadn't just ruined her life. "Sit down," she said, her voice flat. He sat, his expression shifting to concern. "What's wrong?" What's wrong? She laughed, the sound bitter even to her own ears. What's wrong is that I spent last night discovering that my client is connected to Louise White's organization. What's wrong is that I've apparently been retained to defend someone involved in organized crime. What's wrong is that you lied to me. Albert's face went carefully neutral. I never lied. You called it corporate defense. You said it was nothing complicated. It is corporate defense, he said quietly. And I never said the corporation was legitimate. Chloe stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. Get out. Get out of my office right now. I'm withdrawing from your case. I'm refunding your retainer. I'm done. Chloe. I said, get out. Her voice cracked. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've spent 6 years building this firm. 6 years proving that someone like me, a black woman from the worst neighborhood in West Philly, could make it in this business. And you just walked in and destroyed it all because you thought you could buy your way out of whatever criminal mess you're in. Albert didn't move. He just sat there, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. I read about you, he said finally. In the Philadelphia Tribune. The lawyer who never loses. They wrote about how you'd grown up with nothing, how you'd fought your way through law school, how you'd turned down 6-figure corporate offers to open your own practice because you believed in justice. Don't, Chloe warned. Don't you dare try to manipulate me with my own story. I'm not manipulating you. I'm telling you why I chose you. He leaned forward, his intensity suddenly focused entirely on her. Louise White ended my father's life when I was 17 years old, made it look like a construction accident. My father was an honest contractor who refused to inflate project costs to hide White's money. So White had him eliminated. Chloe felt her anger waver. Albert, I spent 15 years infiltrating his organization, he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion flickering across his face. 15 years becoming exactly what White wanted. Loyal, useful, unquestioning. I learned his business, earned his trust, and documented everything. Every transaction, every deal, every crime. I have evidence that could destroy his entire empire. Then why do you need me? Because I got caught. His jaw tightened. Not by law enforcement, by White. He suspects I've been gathering evidence. And he's framed me for crimes I didn't commit to discredit anything I might reveal. The charges I'm facing are real, but I didn't commit them. White did, using my name. And now his organization won't provide legal defense because they're setting me up to take the fall for decades of criminal activity. Chloe sank back into her chair. This is insane. I know. If I defend you, if I go up against Louise White, I could lose everything. My firm, my reputation, possibly my life. I know, Albert said again. That's why I chose you. Because you're the only lawyer I've read about who might actually be brave enough to do it. They sat in silence, the morning sun streaming through her office windows, casting long shadows across her desk. Chloe thought about her childhood, about the public defender who'd helped her mother when she couldn't afford a lawyer, about every case she'd won for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Tell me everything, she said finally. And I mean everything. No more secrets, no more carefully edited case files. If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to risk everything I've built, I need the complete truth. Albert's shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Chloe said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. You might not like the questions I'm about to ask, but as he began talking, detailing 15 years of calculated infiltration and patient revenge, Chloe realized something that terrified her more than Louise White, or criminal charges, or losing her firm. She believed him, every word, and somewhere beneath her professional determination, beneath her fear and anger, she felt something else stirring, a dangerous recognition that this man sitting across from her desk wasn't just a client, he was someone worth fighting for. Chloe had always prided herself on reading people. It was a survival skill she'd picked up early, knowing when her mother's boyfriend was in a bad mood, when a teacher actually cared versus just going through the motions, when opposing counsel was bluffing in depositions. She could spot a liar from across a courtroom, which was why Albert Jackman terrified her, because as he sat across from her desk, hands folded calmly in his lap like they were discussing a parking ticket instead of organized crime, she couldn't detect a single tell. No nervous fidgeting, no defensive posturing, no performative emotion, just steady, unwavering eye contact and a voice that carried the weight of something she couldn't quite name. My father was Samuel Jackman, Albert began, and Chloe noticed the slight catch in his voice when he said the name, the first crack in his composure. He owned a construction company in South Jersey. Small operation, maybe 20 employees, but honest. He built schools, community centers, low-income housing. The kind of projects that actually mattered. Chloe found herself leaning forward despite her better judgment. There was something in the way Albert spoke about his father, reverence mixed with grief, that hadn't faded even after what she assumed were years. When I was 16, Louise White approached my father with a proposal. White owned several commercial properties that needed renovation, and he wanted my father's company to handle the work. The money was good. Too good. Albert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My father looked at the contracts and realized what White wanted: inflated invoices, phantom labor costs, materials that were never purchased. The renovations were real, but the paperwork was designed to hide money, to make dirty money look legitimate. Money laundering, Chloe said quietly. Exactly. Albert's gaze never wavered. My father refused, said he'd built his business on integrity, and he wasn't about to compromise that for anyone, regardless of how much money they offered. White didn't take it well. The office suddenly felt smaller. Chloe was aware of every sound: the hum of the air conditioning, Jamie's muffled voice in the next room, the distant traffic from Market Street below. 3 weeks later, there was an accident at one of my father's job sites. A scaffolding collapse. Albert's voice remained steady, but his hands clenched slightly. OSHA investigated, found faulty equipment, improperly installed supports, safety violations my father would never have allowed. The official report blamed negligence, my father's negligence, but it wasn't, Chloe said. No, it was sabotage. Professional, untraceable sabotage that ended my father's life and destroyed his reputation in one efficient move. The company went bankrupt from the lawsuits. My mother lost our house, and Louise White sent flowers to the funeral. Albert's smile was cold enough to frost glass. White roses, with a card that said, "Sorry for your loss." Chloe felt something twist in her chest. She'd seen a lot of grief in her career clients who'd lost everything, families destroyed by the system, but there was something particularly devastating about the way Albert recounted this story. No dramatic flourishes, no tears, just clinical precision masking an ocean of pain. I was 17, Albert continued. Angry, broke, and suddenly very motivated. I spent a year researching White's organization, learning how it worked, who the key players were, what they valued. Then I walked into one of White's legitimate businesses, a shipping company in Camden, and asked for a job. At 18, Chloe couldn't hide her surprise. At 18. Albert's expression softened slightly, almost amused. I was young, eager, and had nothing to lose. Exactly the kind of recruit organizations like White's look for. They hired me to load trucks. Minimum wage, overnight shifts, the kind of work nobody wants. But I showed up every day, never complained, and paid attention to everything. That's insane, Chloe said. You infiltrated a criminal organization at 18 years old? I prefer committed, Albert said, and there was the briefest flash of humor in his dark eyes. Though my therapist has other words for it. Despite everything, the danger, the implications, the complete insanity of this situation, Chloe felt her lips twitch. You have a therapist? Even vengeful sons need mental health support. Counselor. The humor faded. It took 2 years before anyone in White's inner circle even noticed me. 4 years before I was promoted to anything that mattered. 7 years before I was invited to meetings where actual business was discussed. And 15 years before, White trusted me enough to involve me in operations that could actually take him down. Chloe did the math. You're 32? 33 last month. Spent half my life playing a role, building a reputation as someone loyal to an organization I despised, doing things I'm not proud of to maintain my cover. Albert's voice took on an edge. I documented everything, every transaction, every deal, every crime. I have financial records, recordings, testimony from witnesses willing to cooperate, enough evidence to dismantle White's entire empire and put him away for the rest of his life. Then why haven't you? Chloe demanded. Why not just turn it all over to the FBI? Because White suspected something 6 months ago. Albert's composure finally cracked, frustration bleeding through. I don't know what tipped him off. Maybe I asked one too many questions. Maybe someone noticed my pattern of documentation, but he started testing me, setting up situations to see if I'd report them, watching who I contacted, monitoring my communications. And then I got arrested. Albert laughed, but there was no humor in it. Charged with racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. All crimes that were actually committed by White's organization, but with my name attached to the paperwork. White set me up beautifully, used my access and credentials to make it look like I'd been running operations without his knowledge. The perfect fall guy. Chloe felt her legal mind kick into gear despite her reservations. So White gets to eliminate someone he suspects of gathering evidence while also having a convenient scapegoat for crimes he actually committed. Exactly. And here's the best part: the organization's lawyers, the ones on White's payroll who've made dozens of cases disappear over the years, suddenly can't represent me due to conflicts of interest. Albert's air quotes were bitter. I'm facing federal charges with no legal support from the very organization that framed me. And if I try to use the evidence I've gathered to defend myself, I'll have to reveal my 15-year infiltration, which will make me look like either a liar or a criminal informant. Either way, my credibility is destroyed, and the evidence becomes questionable. So you need a lawyer who can defend you without exposing your operation, Chloe said slowly, while simultaneously gathering additional evidence that can be used to prosecute White separately. I need someone brilliant enough to navigate an impossible case and brave enough to go up against the most dangerous man in Philadelphia. Albert leaned forward. I need you, Chloe. Why me specifically? There are bigger firms, lawyers with more resources, because they're all either working for White or too scared to oppose him. I needed someone outside that system, someone with a reputation for integrity who wouldn't be swayed by threats or bribes, someone who grew up fighting and never forgot how. Albert's intensity was almost overwhelming. I read that article about you 3 times, the lawyer who never loses. They quoted you saying, "Justice isn't about who can afford the best defense, it's about what's right." I need someone who actually believes that. Chloe wanted to argue, to tell him he was romanticizing her principles, to explain that believing in justice and actively fighting organized crime were 2 very different things. But she couldn't, because he was right. She did believe it, had built her entire career on it. If I take this case, she said carefully, if I agree to defend you and help expose White, I need complete transparency. No more edited files, no more convenient omissions. Every detail, every risk, every potential complication. Can you do that? Yes. And you understand that going up against Louise White means both of us are putting targets on our backs? That this could cost us everything? I've had a target on my back for 15 years, Albert said quietly. The only difference now is I'm finally ready to shoot back. They sat in silence for a long moment. Chloe thought about her mother, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed, about the public defender who'd helped them pro bono when they had nothing, about every client she'd fought for who the system had tried to crush, about what her life would mean if she turned away now. All right, she said finally. I'll do it. But we do this my way, following my strategy, with complete honesty between us. The first lie you tell me, the first detail you omit, I walk. Understood? Albert's shoulders dropped slightly, relief visible for the first time. Understood. Good. Now start talking. I want every detail of White's organization, your infiltration, the charges against you, and what evidence you have. We have a lot of work to do. As Albert began outlining 15 years of calculated deception and patient revenge, Chloe felt something shift inside her. This was bigger than any case she'd ever taken, more dangerous, more complicated, and with stakes that extended far beyond a single client. But watching Albert's face as he talked about his father, seeing the determination mixed with grief and hope, Chloe realized something that should have worried her more than it did. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. As we continue, I'd love to know, what city are you listening from? Please drop your location in the comments. Kindly hit that subscribe button too. Thank you. The thing about building a case against the most powerful criminal organization in Philadelphia was that it required an absolutely obscene amount of coffee and an alarming disregard for normal human sleep schedules. Chloe discovered this 3 days into her deep dive of Albert's evidence, when she looked up from a financial ledger at 2:47 a.m. and realized she'd somehow consumed an entire pot of coffee without noticing. Her office had transformed into something resembling a beautiful disaster, documents covering every surface, sticky notes creating a rainbow of accusations across her walls, and Albert Jackman sprawled in the chair across from her desk, looking unfairly alert for someone who'd been there since 6 p.m. How are you not exhausted? Chloe demanded, rubbing her eyes. She'd changed out of her professional suit hours ago into the emergency outfit she kept in her office, temple law sweatpants and a hoodie that had seen better days. Albert, meanwhile, Still looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread, though he'd at least removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "Years of practice," Albert said, not looking up from the encrypted file he was decoding on her laptop. "When you spend 15 years maintaining a cover, you get used to functioning on 3 hours of sleep in pure spite. That's not healthy. Neither is drinking coffee at 3 in the morning, but here we are." He glanced up, and there was that almost smile again, the one that made Chloe's stomach do something she absolutely refused to acknowledge. "Want me to make a fresh pot? Please. And maybe see if that bagel place on the corner is open yet? I think I forgot to eat dinner." "You definitely forgot to eat dinner. I watched you skip lunch too." Albert stood, stretching, and Chloe definitely did not notice the way his dress shirt pulled across his shoulders. "You're going to be useless in court if you pass out from malnutrition. I'm fine. You're surviving on caffeine and determination, which is admirable but unsustainable." He grabbed his wallet. "Bagels, coffee, and I'm getting you one of those fruit things, so you have at least one vitamin today." After he left, Chloe let herself slump back in her chair. This had been her life for the past 2 weeks, marathon work sessions that started after her associates went home and stretched until sunrise. Albert would arrive at 6 p.m. with dinner and his encyclopedic knowledge of Louise White's operations, and they'd work through the night building a defense strategy that was equal parts brilliant and insane. The case itself was a nightmare. The prosecution had financial records showing Albert's involvement in money laundering operations, witness testimony placing him at key meetings, and communications linking him to criminal activity. On paper, it was damning, the kind of case that made defense attorneys wake up in cold sweats. But Albert had spent 15 years meticulously documenting everything. For every transaction the prosecution claimed he'd orchestrated, he had evidence showing White's direct orders. For every meeting he'd attended, he had recordings proving he was there under White's command. It was like watching someone build a case against themselves, while simultaneously constructing their own defense. "The problem," Chloe had explained on day 3, "is that we can't just present your evidence without context. If we reveal you've been secretly gathering information for 15 years, it looks like you're a criminal trying to flip on your organization to save yourself. So what do? We build a narrative. Show that every action you took was under duress or direct orders. Establish that you had no autonomy within the organization. Make the jury see you as someone trapped in an impossible situation, not someone who chose criminal activity." Albert had looked at her with something that made her chest tight. "You're remarkable. I'm practical," Chloe had corrected, ignoring the warmth creeping up her neck. "And I'm expensive. So let's make sure we win this thing." Now, surrounded by evidence of 15 years of calculated deception, Chloe was beginning to understand the scope of what Albert had done. He hadn't just infiltrated White's organization, he'd become essential to it. He'd managed legitimate businesses that fronted illegal operations, handled logistics for shipments he knew were criminal, attended meetings where people's fates were decided, all while documenting everything. The evidence was meticulous. Financial records with timestamps and authentication, audio recordings with context notes, witness statements from people Albert had carefully cultivated over years. It was the kind of documentation that could dismantle an empire, if they could figure out how to use it without getting Albert convicted in the process. The office door opened, and Albert returned carrying a bag that smelled like heaven. "They just opened. Got you an everything bagel with cream cheese, a fruit cup that looks suspiciously healthy, and," he produced a second coffee cup with a flourish, "an actual latte, instead of whatever burnt nightmare our coffee maker produces." "You're a saint," Chloe said, reaching for the bag. Their fingers brushed and she pulled back quickly, professional boundaries reasserting themselves. "Thanks." If Albert noticed her reaction, he didn't comment. He just settled back into his chair and returned to the laptop. "I've been thinking about the Castellano transaction. The shipping containers in 2019? Right. The prosecution is using them as evidence of my involvement in smuggling operations. But if you look at the actual manifests," he turned the laptop so she could see, leaning forward to point at the screen, "the containers were flagged by customs. White knew they'd be inspected, so he deliberately used my credentials to process them. When they were seized, it created a paper trail, showing my incompetence, while the real shipment came through a different port entirely." Chloe leaned in to study the documents, suddenly very aware that Albert smelled like cedar, and something expensive she couldn't identify. "So he was setting you up even back then?" "He's been setting people up for 30 years. I just didn't realize I'd become a target until recently." Albert's voice was close, his shoulder nearly touching hers as they both focused on the screen. "But here's the thing, I have the manifest for the real shipment. It came through Newark under a different company's name. But I recognize the signature authorizing it." "Whose signature?" "White's personal attorney, the one who's conveniently recused himself from my case." Albert pulled up another file. "And if we cross-reference the dates," Chloe saw it immediately. "The real shipment came through the same day the decoy containers were seized. White used you as a distraction." "Exactly. Which means we can prove you were a patsy, not a participant." "Albert, this is brilliant." She turned to look at him and realized he was inches away, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, the faint scar through his left eyebrow that she'd been curious about for days. They froze. Chloe became acutely aware of several things simultaneously. The coffee cooling on her desk, the quiet hum of the building's night ventilation system, the way Albert was looking at her like she'd just solved the world's most complicated equation, and the completely inappropriate way her heart was currently trying to escape her chest. "Chloe," Albert said quietly, and his voice had dropped into a register that should be illegal. "We should," she cleared her throat, pulling back. "We should document this. The timeline, the connection between the shipments, everything." "Right." Albert leaned back, and Chloe told herself she wasn't disappointed by the sudden distance. "Documentation. Very professional." "Extremely professional," Chloe agreed, focusing very hard on her bagel. "That's what we're here for. Professional legal strategy." Of course. They worked in silence for several minutes, the awkward tension gradually dissipating into their normal, collaborative rhythm. But Chloe couldn't quite shake the awareness of him the way he drummed his fingers against the desk when he was thinking, how he unconsciously loosened his tie when he was frustrated, the quiet satisfaction in his voice when they uncovered another piece of evidence. Around 4 a.m., Chloe stood to stretch and found herself at the window overlooking Market Street. The city was that special kind of quiet that only existed in the hours between night and morning, when even Philadelphia took a breath. "Can I ask you something?" Albert's voice came from behind her. "Depends on the question. Why did you really take this case?" He joined her at the window, maintaining a careful distance. "And don't say it's about justice or integrity. I read the article about you. You've turned down plenty of high-profile cases before. Cases that would have made you famous and didn't come with the risk of being targeted by organized crime. So why this one?" "Why me?" Chloe considered lying, deflecting, giving him the professional answer she'd been telling herself for 2 weeks. But it was 4 a.m., and they were standing in her office surrounded by evidence that could get them both eliminated, and she was too tired for pretense. "Because when you talked about your father," she said slowly, "I saw my mother. Different circumstances, same grief. She worked 3 jobs after my father left, trying to keep us afloat in a neighborhood where people like us weren't supposed to make it. When I was 12, her boss at the hotel tried to assault her. She fought back, and he had her arrested for assault. Would have gone to prison if a public defender hadn't taken her case pro bono and proved she acted in self-defense." Albert stayed quiet, letting her talk. "That lawyer didn't have to help us. We couldn't pay. We had no connections, no influence. But she fought for my mother anyway because it was right, because someone had to." Chloe turned to face him. "Your father refused to compromise his integrity even when it cost him everything. My mother fought back even when the system was designed to destroy her. I became a lawyer because I wanted to be the person who stands up when everyone else walks away. So when you walked into my office with an impossible case and decades of grief in your eyes, I saw someone worth fighting for, even if it's dangerous, even if I lose everything." "You won't lose everything," Albert said, and there was steel in his voice. "I won't let that happen. You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to protect you." He held her gaze. "You're brilliant, Chloe. The way you see patterns in evidence, the strategies you're building. I've watched White's lawyers work for years, and none of them have your instinct, your intelligence. You're going to win this case." "We're going to win this case," Chloe corrected. "This is a partnership." "A partnership," Albert agreed, and something in the way he said it made her pulse quicken. The moment stretched between them, charged with things neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Then Chloe's phone alarm went off, her 5 a.m. reminder that she had exactly 3 hours before her associates arrived, and she needed to at least look like she'd gone home. She gestured vaguely at the organized chaos of her office. "Try to look less like I've been living here." "Right. I'll help clean up." They worked in comfortable silence, organizing documents back into files, taking down sticky notes, returning the office to something resembling professional order. When Albert reached for the same folder Chloe was grabbing, their hands collided and lingered for just a second too long before they both pulled away. "Same time tomorrow?" Albert asked as they finished. "Tomorrow's Saturday." Did I stutter? Chloe laughed despite her exhaustion. "You're relentless." "I prefer dedicated," Albert said, echoing their conversation from weeks ago. And there was that almost smile again. "Besides, I'm starting to suspect you enjoy our midnight strategy sessions." "They're efficient," Chloe said primly, absolutely not thinking about how much she'd been looking forward to these evenings. Maximum productivity, with minimal distractions. Of course, very professional, extremely professional. They stood at her office door, neither quite ready to leave despite the exhaustion pulling at them both. "Chloe," Albert said quietly, "thank you. For believing me. For taking this risk. For hesitated. For seeing past what I've had to become, and recognizing what I'm trying to do." "Thank you for trusting me with it," Chloe replied. "Now go home and get some actual sleep. I need you sharp for tomorrow's session." "Yes, counselor." After he left, Chloe sat in her quiet office and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to acknowledge that maintaining professional boundaries with Albert Jackman was becoming significantly more difficult than building a defense against federal charges. Then she packed up her laptop, turned off the lights, and headed home with the sunrise painting Philadelphia gold. She had a case to win. The first warning came disguised as professional courtesy. Harrison Webb, a senior partner at one of Philadelphia's most prestigious firms, called Chloe 3 weeks into Albert's case with fatherly concern dripping through his voice like poison honey. "Chloe, dear, I heard you're representing Albert Jackman. I wanted to reach out lawyer to lawyer and suggest you reconsider. That's a career-ending case for someone with your promising future. I appreciate your concern, Harrison, but I'm quite comfortable with my client choices." "Comfortable?" He'd laughed, the sound brittle. "Sweetheart, you're playing with fire. White's organization doesn't forget lawyers who oppose them. Think about your future." Chloe had hung up feeling cold. Harrison Webb didn't make courtesy calls. He made strategic moves disguised as friendly advice. The second warning was less subtle. Her favorite coffee shop, the one 2 blocks from her office where she'd been a regular for 4 years, suddenly couldn't serve her. "We're at capacity," the barista said, not meeting her eyes, despite 3 empty tables and the owner watching nervously from the back. By week 4, former colleagues were crossing the street to avoid her. The prosecutor, who'd been friendly during their last case together, now responded to her emails with single-word answers. Her law school study group chat went silent whenever she posted. Then her mother called. "Chloe Marie Martins, what the hell are you doing?" Her mother's voice shook with fear masquerading as anger. "I have people at the hospital asking me if you've lost your mind. They're saying you're defending some criminal, that you're going to get yourself hurt." "Mama, it's not like that." "Then what is it like?" "Because I didn't work 3 jobs and sacrifice everything so you could throw away your life defending dangerous people." Her mother's voice cracked. "Baby, please, drop this case. Come home. We'll figure something else out." Chloe closed her eyes, her mother's fear settling like lead in her stomach. "I can't, Mama. This is important. More important than staying alive?" She didn't have an answer that would satisfy her mother. So she promised to be careful, promised to call every day, and felt guilt gnaw at her bones. The explicit threats started on a Tuesday. A manila envelope arrived at her office with no return address. Inside were photographs: Chloe leaving her apartment, Chloe at the courthouse, Chloe having coffee with Albert. Each photo had a red X marked over her face. No note. The message was clear enough. "We need to call the police," Jamie insisted, her hands shaking as she held one of the photos. "And tell them what? That someone took pictures in public spaces?" Chloe tried to sound calmer than she felt. "We have no proof of actual threats." The proof came 3 days later when Chloe arrived at her office to find the door ajar and the lock jimmied. Nothing was stolen that would have been too obvious. Instead, someone had gone through every file, every drawer, leaving them just slightly out of place. A clear message: "We can reach you whenever we want." But the truly chilling part was the single sheet of paper left on her desk, with 2 words typed in the center: "Stop now." Albert took one look at the ransacked office and his jaw went rigid. "That's it. You're getting protection. I don't need. This isn't negotiable, Chloe." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "I have someone I trust completely. Former military, discreet, and completely loyal to me, not White. He'll watch your building, make sure no one tries this again. Albert, I can take care of myself." "I know you can, but you shouldn't have to." He stepped closer, intensity radiating off him. This is my fault. My case. My vendetta. My danger. Let me at least make sure you're safe while you're fighting for me. Chloe wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need protecting, to maintain her independence. But standing in her violated office with photographs of herself marked for potential elimination, she recognized reality. She'd crossed the point of no return. Either she won this case spectacularly and brought down Louise White's entire empire, or she lost everything, her practice, her reputation, possibly her life. There was no middle ground anymore, no graceful exit, no way to simply walk away. So Chloe made a choice. She looked Albert in the eye and said, "Fine, but tell your guy to stay invisible. I have a reputation to maintain." "Done. And Albert?" She straightened her shoulders, feeling something crystallize inside her. "They just made this personal. So let's stop playing defense and start destroying them." His smile was sharp enough to cut. "Now you're speaking my language, counselor." The federal courthouse on Market Street had never seen anything like this. News vans lined the street 3 deep, reporters jockeying for position on the steps, and a crowd of spectators that started forming at 6 a.m. for a trial that didn't begin until 9. Chloe navigated through the chaos with her head high and her best suit on like armor, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity, every seat filled, standing room only, with federal marshals stationed at every door. Chloe spotted familiar faces in the gallery, other defense attorneys who'd come to watch her either triumph or crash spectacularly. Prosecutors who wanted to see how she'd handle the impossible. And in the back corner, barely visible, an elderly man in an expensive suit who could only be Louise White himself. Albert sat beside her at the defense table, perfectly composed in a tailored navy suit, looking more like a Fortune 500 CEO than someone facing 20 years in federal prison. Under the table, his leg bounced with nervous energy only she could see. "Breathe," Chloe murmured. "We've got this." "I know. I trust you." Those 3 words settled something in her chest. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Morrison painted Albert as a calculating criminal who'd spent 15 years climbing the ranks of White's organization, profiting from illegal operations while hiding behind a facade of legitimacy. She presented financial records showing millions moving through accounts bearing Albert's name, witness testimony placing him at key criminal meetings, and communications that seemed to prove his willing participation. "The evidence will show," Morrison concluded, her voice ringing through the courtroom, "that Albert Jackman wasn't a victim of this organization. He was the architect of its success." Chloe stood for her opening statement and felt the weight of every eye in the room. "The prosecution wants you to see documents and assume guilt," she began, her voice steady and clear. "They want you to look at a name on a bank account and conclude criminality. But what they won't tell you is the context behind every signature, every transaction, every meeting. They won't tell you about a 17-year-old boy who watched his father's life end in a suspicious accident. They won't tell you about 15 years of carefully documented evidence that Mr. Jackman gathered while trapped inside an organization that would have ended his life if they'd discovered his true purpose." She paused, letting that sink in. "By the end of this trial, you won't just see Albert Jackman as innocent. You'll see him as the bravest witness against organized crime that Philadelphia has ever known." The prosecution called their witnesses accountants who traced money flows, federal agents who described surveillance operations, former associates who testified about Albert's involvement in syndicate business. Each one seemed to build an insurmountable case, but Chloe dismantled them piece by piece. She cross-examined the accountant about whose signatures actually authorized the transactions, revealing that while Albert's name appeared on accounts, Louise White's personal attorney had signing authority. She got the federal agent to admit that Albert had never been directly observed committing crimes, only attending meetings and managing legitimate business operations. She exposed the former associates as current members of White's organization who'd been offered reduced sentences for their testimony. 3 days into trial, with the prosecution's case weakening under her relentless cross-examination, Chloe made her move. The defense calls Albert Jackman to the stand. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Morrison shot to her feet. "Your Honor, the defendant has no obligation to testify. The defendant has every right to testify if he chooses," Judge Patricia Hamilton said firmly. "Mr. Jackman, approach the stand." Albert stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the witness stand with the bearing of someone who'd been waiting 15 years for exactly this moment. As he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, Chloe saw Louise White lean forward in the gallery, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. This was it. The moment everything changed. "Mr. Jackman," Chloe began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "Please tell the jury about your father, Samuel Jackman, and what happened to him 17 years ago." Albert took a breath and began to speak. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Albert's testimony began quietly, almost conversationally, as he described his father, a good man who built schools and community centers, who believed integrity mattered more than profit. The jury leaned forward, drawn in despite themselves. Even Morrison seemed uncertain whether to object, sensing that interrupting this moment would only make her look callous. Then Albert described the accident. The scaffolding collapse that was too convenient, too perfectly timed, too professionally executed to be negligence. His voice remained steady as he detailed the OSHA investigation that destroyed his father's reputation posthumously, the lawsuits that bankrupted his family, the white roses that arrived at the funeral with a card that said, "Sorry for your loss." "From Louise White?" Chloe asked. "From Louise White," Albert confirmed, and his eyes found the elderly man in the back of the gallery. White's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze, recognition that he'd miscalculated badly. "What did you do after your father's death?" "I got angry. Then I got strategic." Albert's jaw tightened. "I spent a year researching White's organization, learning how it operated, who the key players were, what they valued. Then I walked into one of his legitimate businesses and asked for a job." "At 18 years old, you deliberately infiltrated a criminal organization?" "Yes." "Why?" Albert's answer was simple and devastating. "Because I wanted to destroy it from the inside." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the court reporter's fingers on the keys. Chloe let the statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Tell the jury about your first 2 years in the organization." Albert described loading trucks at midnight, working double shifts, never complaining, always watching. How he'd deliberately made himself invaluable to low-level managers, learning the logistics that kept White's empire running. How he'd started noticing patterns, shipments that didn't match manifests, payments that disappeared into shell companies, conversations that stopped when outsiders approached. "And you documented this?" "From day one." Albert's voice strengthened. "I kept detailed records of everything I witnessed. Dates, times, people involved, amounts transferred. I bought a secure external drive and backed up everything weekly. I knew if I was going to take down an organization this powerful, I needed ironclad evidence." Chloe walked to the defense table and retrieved a thick binder. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit A, a comprehensive timeline of the defendant's documentation over 15 years. Morrison objected relevance, foundation, authentication, but Judge Hamilton overruled her. The binder went to the jury, and Chloe watched their eyes widen as they flipped through pages of meticulous records. "Mr. Jackman, let's talk about your promotion in 2015. You became a logistics coordinator for White's shipping operations. What did that involve? On paper? Managing legitimate freight transportation. In reality?" Albert's expression hardened. "Coordinating shipments that contained everything from stolen electronics to substances that would get you 20 years in federal prison. White used legitimate businesses as cover for criminal operations. My job was to make sure the real cargo got through customs, while decoy shipments drew attention. And you documented this? Every shipment. Every manifest. Every time White ordered me to falsify paperwork or coordinate with corrupt officials." Albert gestured to the binder. "Page 47 has the Castellano transaction from 2019. The prosecution claims I was smuggling contraband. The truth is, White deliberately used my credentials to process decoy containers he knew would be seized, while the real shipment came through Newark under a different company's name." Chloe pulled up the documents on the courtroom screen. "Can you explain this to the jury?" Albert walked them through it, how White's attorney had signed off on the real shipment the same day Albert's decoy containers were seized. How the timing proved coordination, how Albert had been set up to take the fall even back then. "White's been building cases against potential threats for years," Albert said, "accumulating evidence against his own people so he can eliminate them whenever convenient. I just didn't realize I'd become a target until recently." The first day of testimony ended with Albert describing his rise through the organization, each promotion bringing more access, more evidence, more risk. The courtroom was riveted. Media coverage that night was explosive. Mafia infiltrator takes the stand. 15-year undercover operation revealed. The trial that could topple an empire. Day 2 of Albert's testimony was when Chloe truly went for the throat. "Mr. Jackman, Let's discuss Louis White's financial operations in detail. Start with the real estate holdings. Albert proceeded to methodically dismantle White's empire piece by piece. He described properties purchased with laundered money, construction projects that existed only on paper, rental income that was actually payment for criminal services. For each operation, he provided documentation, bank records, property deeds, communications between White and his associates. Defense Exhibit M, Chloe said, pulling up a spreadsheet on the screen. Can you explain this document? That's a complete financial trail of White's money laundering from 2018 to 2023. Every shell company, every offshore account, every transaction designed to hide criminal proceeds. I created this spreadsheet using White's own financial records, which I copied over 5 years. Morrison was on her feet. Your Honor, this is beyond the scope of the defendant's trial. Your Honor, Chloe interrupted smoothly. The prosecution has built their case on the premise that my client was a willing participant in criminal operations. I'm establishing that he was actually gathering evidence against the organization's leader. This goes directly to his intent and state of mind. Judge Hamilton considered, then nodded. I'll allow it. Continue, Miss Martins. Chloe smiled. Mr. Jackman, do you have recordings of Louis White ordering criminal activity? Yes. 17 recordings over 8 years. The courtroom exploded in whispers. Judge Hamilton's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. Chloe played 3 recordings. White's voice was unmistakable, cultured, calm, ordering activities that ranged from witness intimidation to the permanent removal of business rivals. In one particularly damning recording, White explicitly discussed framing Albert. The Jackman boy is getting too curious. Start putting his name on paperwork. If he becomes a problem, we'll have everything we need to eliminate him legally. Louis White's expression finally cracked. His lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently, but White waved him off with a hand that trembled slightly. Mr. Jackman, Chloe continued, why didn't you take this evidence to authorities earlier? Because I needed enough to take down the entire organization, not just get White arrested while his lieutenants took over. I needed evidence of the complete structure, who gave orders, who executed them, how money moved, where bodies were hidden. Albert's voice was steel. I needed to make sure that when this empire fell, it stayed down. And do you have that evidence? Yes. Names, dates, locations, financial records, witness statements from people willing to testify if granted protection. Everything the FBI would need to dismantle this organization completely. Judge Hamilton's face had gone pale. She called for a sidebar, and what followed was a hushed but clearly urgent conversation between the judge, Morrison, and Chloe. When they returned, Hamilton's voice was grave. In light of the testimony and evidence presented, this court is ordering an immediate federal investigation into the allegations against Louis White and associated parties. The U.S. Marshals are directed to take Mr. White into custody pending charges. The courtroom detonated into chaos. Marshals moved toward the gallery where White sat, still and silent as stone. His lawyers erupted in objections. Their client was merely observing a trial. This was unprecedented. They demanded due process, but Hamilton's gavel silenced them. Mr. White, you're being detained as a material witness pending investigation. You have the right to remain silent. White stood with dignity, buttoning his suit jacket as marshals approached. For just a moment, his eyes met Albert's across the courtroom. Not angry, not afraid, just a brief acknowledgement between enemies who'd been playing a 15-year game that had finally reached checkmate. As marshals led White out, reporters rushed for the doors, camera crews scrambled for position, and the courtroom descended into beautiful, victorious pandemonium. Chloe turned to Albert, whose hands were shaking slightly as adrenaline crashed through him. We did it, she said quietly, and realized her own voice was unsteady. You did it, Albert corrected. I just told the truth. You made them listen. The trial was suspended pending the investigation into White. Morrison approached the defense table looking shell-shocked. Miss Martins, the U.S. Attorney's Office will be reviewing all charges against your client in light of this testimony. Translation. They were dropping the case. Albert would walk free. Chloe had done the impossible, turned a criminal defense into the prosecution of an entire criminal empire. The formal acquittal came 3 weeks later, though everyone knew the outcome the moment Louis White was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The U.S. Attorney's Office dropped all charges against Albert Jackman with a tersely worded statement about new evidence and cooperation with ongoing investigations. What they really meant was, We just realized we were prosecuting the wrong person, while the actual criminal mastermind sat in our courtroom watching. Chloe arrived at the courthouse that morning to a media circus that made the trial coverage look quaint. Every major network had sent reporters, legal analysts were providing breathless commentary, and her phone had approximately 700 unread messages from journalists requesting interviews. She'd turned them all down, except one, a local Philadelphia station that had covered her pro bono work years ago when nobody else cared. Miss Martins, how does it feel to have brought down the most powerful criminal organization in Philadelphia? Can you comment on reports that the FBI is using your client's evidence to build cases against 17 additional defendants? Is it true that Harvard Law wants to do a case study on your defense strategy? Chloe ignored the shouted questions and headed inside, where Jamie and Rochelle were waiting with coffee and barely contained excitement. Boss, you're trending on Twitter, Rochelle said, showing her phone. Number 3 nationwide, right below a celebrity breakup and above a political scandal. That's deeply weird, Chloe muttered, but she couldn't suppress her smile. Weird but lucrative, Jamie added. We've had 43 calls this week from potential clients. High-profile cases, corporate defense, even a few asking if you'd consider prosecution work. We'll sort through them later. Right now, I need to focus on getting my client officially cleared. The hearing itself was anticlimactic. Judge Hamilton read the dismissal order, commended Albert for his courage in coming forward, and formally acquitted him of all charges. Morrison wasn't even present. She'd sent a junior prosecutor to handle the paperwork. The entire proceeding took less than 15 minutes. But when the judge's gavel fell for the final time, declaring Albert Jackman a free man, the small gallery erupted in applause. Chloe's mother was there, tears streaming down her face. Her associates cheered. Even a few other defense attorneys who'd come to witness the conclusion of the case that had captivated the legal community stood and clapped. Albert turned to Chloe, and the look on his face made her chest tight. Relief, gratitude, and something deeper that she'd been carefully not examining for months. Thank you, he said simply. But those 2 words carried the weight of 15 years. Outside the courtroom, the celebration continued. News had spread about Louise White's formal indictment, 17 counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit acts that had resulted in multiple permanent disappearances over 3 decades. The FBI had executed search warrants on 23 properties and arrested 11 associates. White's empire was crumbling in spectacular fashion, and it was all because of the evidence Albert had spent 15 years gathering and Chloe had brilliantly brought to light. The media found them on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Chloe found herself giving an impromptu press conference that would be replayed on news channels for weeks. This case was never about defending criminal activity, she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. It was about revealing the truth that my client spent 15 years of his life infiltrating a criminal organization to gather evidence that could bring it down. Albert Jackman is a hero, not a criminal, and I'm honored to have represented him. Miss Martins, you're being called the lawyer who destroyed a syndicate. How does that feel? Chloe laughed. I prefer the lawyer who believed her client, but I'll take it. What's next for you? Sleep, she said honestly. So much sleep. And then we'll see what cases come our way. The press conference ended, but the chaos continued. Well-wishers, curious lawyers, even a few celebrities who happened to be at the courthouse for unrelated matters wanted to congratulate her. Chloe handled it all with grace, but she could feel exhaustion creeping in around the edges of her adrenaline. Finally, blessedly, the crowd thinned. Her mother hugged her tight enough to crack ribs, made her promise to come to dinner on Sunday, and left with Jamie and Rochelle, who were already planning a victory celebration at the firm. The reporters drifted away, chasing other stories. The courthouse settled back into its usual rhythm. Chloe found herself alone in a side hallway, leaning against the cool marble wall, and finally letting herself breathe. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, against threats and warnings, and an organization that had operated with impunity for 30 years, they'd actually done it. There you are. She opened her eyes to find Albert walking toward her, jacket slung over his shoulder, tie loosened, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, like someone who'd been carrying a massive weight for 15 years and had finally set it down. Hiding from your adoring public? She asked. Hiding from everyone except you. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes that matched her own. I needed to talk to you, away from cameras and reporters and everyone else. About the case? Because I should warn you, my brain is basically mush right now. Not about the case. Albert's voice softened. About us. Chloe's heart stuttered. Albert, I couldn't have done this without you, he said. And there was raw honesty in every word. Not just the legal strategy, or the brilliant way you orchestrated everything in court. You gave me something to fight for beyond revenge. You made me believe that maybe after 15 years of pretending to be someone I hated, there could be something good waiting on the other side. You gave me hope, Chloe. She should maintain professional distance. Should remind him that their attorney-client relationship technically still existed. Should be sensible and practical, and all the things she'd tried to be during months of midnight strategy sessions and lingering glances. Instead, she told him the truth. I don't just fight for my clients, Albert. I fight for people I believe in. People who deserve better than what they've been given. People who are brave enough to spend 15 years of their life playing a role they despise because they believe in something bigger. She pushed off the wall, closing the distance between them. And somewhere between those midnight strategy sessions and watching you testify about your father and seeing you face down your demons in open court, I started believing in us. Us, Albert repeated, like he was testing the word. As in, I'm done pretending this is just professional, Chloe said. As in, I think about you way too much for someone who's supposed to be maintaining ethical boundaries. As in, I'm either extremely brave or completely insane, but I'm choosing to believe it's the first one. Albert's smile was transformative. You're the bravest person I've ever met. That's the exhaustion talking. He kissed her. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was the kind of kiss that came from months of restraint finally breaking, from two people who'd fought side by side through impossible odds and had emerged victorious. Chloe's hands found his shirt collar, pulling him closer, and Albert's arms wrapped around her waist like he was anchoring himself to something real after years of deception. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Chloe laughed. We just kissed in a federal courthouse hallway. Scandalous, Albert agreed, not looking remotely sorry. The media would have a field day. Then it's fortunate they're all gone. He rested his forehead against hers. What happens now? Chloe considered. They'd toppled an empire, exposed decades of corruption, and somehow emerged on the other side, both professionally triumphant and emotionally raw. The future was uncertain. White's trial would take months. Albert would need to testify in multiple cases, and Chloe's firm was about to become much busier with the flood of new clients. But standing in an empty courthouse hallway with a man who'd spent 15 years fighting for justice and had trusted her to help him finish it, Chloe felt more certain than she'd felt about anything in her life. Now, she smiled, now we figure it out together. They left the courthouse hand in hand, walking into Philadelphia sunshine and a future that was complicated and uncertain but undeniably theirs. Justice had been served. An empire had fallen. And somewhere between defending the impossible and believing in the improbable, Chloe Martins had found something she hadn't been looking for. Love in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. And it was absolutely worth it. If this story captivated you, kindly hit that like button and share it with someone who loves stories about justice, redemption, and unexpected romance. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.